Well, if I understand, I mean, this is a important element to remember. I think we forget. We tend to over-intellectualize, I think, our understanding of our own revolution, as if it was a wonderful sort of glorified book club. All right? You read a little Locke, you read a little Montesquieu, you understand our revolution. That may have been true for some, but what I've tried to do in this book is to reinsert those kinds of things that all of us know. We've been in movements, we've had protests, we've been part of bigger political mobilizations. And that's the reinsertion of emotion. The American people energized their protests because they were angry, they were afraid. They wanted vengeance because they thought some of their neighbors had been killed unjustly. And it's not that liberty and freedom and those high ideas didn't count. They counted a lot. But when you introduce them into a chemical, emotional experiment that it creates energy and drive and the willingness to sacrifice or see your loved one sacrificed, then you have a revolutionary possibility.
So here's a name from the Revolutionary War period who finds a place in your book, who the rest of us probably haven't heard, Matthew Patton. Tell us about him.
Well, that's good. Matthew Patton. People said when I began to write this book, well, look, all right, Breen, this is a nice project. You're going to talk about the ordinary people, ordinary men and women. And how are you going to go about doing it? They probably no records, certainly not the records that you have for the leaders. And what I found was that the ordinary people were waiting to tell me their story. They were hiding in plain sight. They were hiding in forms of letters, newspaper reports, and most emphatically in diaries. And the Patton family in Bedford, New Hampshire is a Scots-Irish hard-scrabble family that came over from Ireland in the 1720s. And Matthew Patton, the patriarch of the family, was slowly, in his diary you can see, slowly drawn into this revolution. People don't just get up one day and say, look, I want to go get killed. They sign petitions, they boycott, they join local neighborhood committees. Only finally, and with the greatest reluctance, do they engage in violence against the state. And you can trace this in this wonderful farm family in this southern New Hampshire. And there were other diaries and other personal accounts that allowed me to introduce people that none of you have ever heard of. Samuel Thompson in Maine, Janet Shaw in North Carolina, the Isaac Davis family of Acton, Massachusetts. Real revolutionaries that haven't had their story told.
In the case of Samuel Thompson, his events even became known as Thompsons War. Now, that's not something I remember from my high school textbook. What was Thompsons War?
We took that out of your book. Samuel Thompson was another Scots-Irishman. I have a weakness for Scots-Irishmen because that's my family, too. Samuel Thompson, if you have any problems with the word insurgency, then you're going to have trouble with Samuel Thompson, because at least a year before the Declaration of Independence, and I stress that, we're talking about the lead up to the declaration that there's a country here. These are people that are sacrificing for something called the American cause, way before. So Thompson kidnaps British naval officers. He arms his men, really basically insurgents. All they have is a sprig of spruce in their caps, and they ride up and down the Maine coast trying to encourage other people to join the revolutionary cause. They had one very interesting mechanism I'll tell you about, because the revolutions are violent, revolutions are tough. We've forgotten that. But Samuel Thompson's men used to, when they found a loyalist, they would say, well, they'd ask him to dig a grave out there in the woods, and he would, and then his men would stand around with their guns cocked at his head and say, have you had any thoughts about whether you'd like to support the American cause or not? And I can tell you he had 100% conversion rate at these moments. Samuel Thompson, another name we don't usually think of in our story.
Which brings up a couple of related terms that you don't always find. One is revenge. It seems as if in the small American towns, there was conflict between different elements in the town. And in fact, you also use the word civil war to describe how this played out in certain places.
Right. Civil war was probably the most common description that people at the time used to describe the run-up to revolution, a war within the British system. But the people did respond, and many communities were divided, but rapidly because of committees of safety, committees of observation. Real loyalist opposition was pretty well quieted, at least in major populous areas. One of the stories I talk about, and I'm quite happy to have been able to reconstruct, is the power of a rumor. And again, I try to tell you that the revolution, as far as the people were concerned, the revolution was on way before 1776. You know, if it hadn't been for their sacrifice, there would have been no Declaration of Independence. That's the point. You see, we're moving forward. But in September 1774, at the time that the Continental Congress met for the first time, they were greeted with the news that came out of Boston. That Boston had been destroyed in an act of revenge by the British Navy, just totally burned to the ground. Men and women in Boston, Americans, had been shot down in the streets. And that rumor mobilized a huge insurgent army in New England. Probably the largest land force that had ever been assembled in North America, including during the French and Indian Wars. Different numbers, 15,000, 20,000, 50,000. One guy over the top said he was sure that 100,000 New Englanders were marching on Boston. The point is that there was this surge of energy, and in towns where there was any opposition, those people were quickly brought on board and shown the American cause in its fullness. Now, Boston, in case any of you are worried, was not burned. There were no Americans shot in the street. But what this indicates is that in this tinderbox of America, long before the Declaration of Independence, people were so unhappy that almost anything, any report, would have electrified the politics of the communities and brought them forward. This is a people's revolution in the fullest sense of people acting without orders of their rulers or their leaders or the people in Congress. They were taking their own political destinies into their own hands.
I think you can already understand that this is a book that does not focus on events in small towns simply because of a curiosity of what might be going on there. Professor Breen makes the case that those events influenced more familiar events, such as what went on in the Continental Congress. One of the things I was reminded about when I read the book is that Paul Revere didn't have only one ride, the famous ride to Lexington and Concord, but in fact he had a number of rides from Boston to Philadelphia.
Right. Well, Paul Revere was a ubiquitous personality in this time, and he had the main route from Boston to Philadelphia. And it was he who brought the news to the First Continental Congress. And I ask you, in your mind's eye, we've been through a lot in our own society, 9/11 most recently. You can imagine what the congressmen of the United States felt during that period when New York suffered. Well, the First Continental Congress was greeted with this news I just told you about, that Boston had just been destroyed. Imagine, at the first meeting of the Continental Congress, these men and women, these planters and lawyers from all over the country were told that the second or third largest city in America had just been leveled. They weren't even ready for war. And the news was brought by Paul Revere, and he figured, of course, in a more famous ride a few years later, And this time, it wasn't a rumor that brought out the insurgents, but the real thing in Lexington Commons.